We'll get started here in a minute. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We are on our third talk of the series, third of 5. And if you are new here, welcome. If you are coming back for the talk, so glad to have you here and hope you hang out with us for the next 2 weeks of talks as well. Before I introduce our speakers and the talk, I just wanted to quickly say that our website, IOW Material Histories, I'm just trying to pick up the link to put it in our chat. IOW Material Histories webinar.org is where we have all our information. So if you want to know more about the talks that's already happened or for the talks that's coming up, please visit our website. We also have videos of our previous talks on YouTube now. So let me just grab that link as well so that you can go see our previous talks. And we're happy to chat. So I would suggest everyone keep themselves on mute, but please feel free to use the chat function to chat and to share information as we've been doing in the last 2 weeks. And thanks for being here. So when I actually began thinking about this webinar series, one of the things that I had in mind was to think about the methods and doing the research for studying Indian Ocean world material histories from all disciplinary angles, and to think about this in interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and even post-disciplinary ways. At the same time, one of the other things that I had in mind was also to think about not as an area studies, to kind of complicate the area studies notion that we have in the Indian Ocean world sphere, where those of us who work in this are usually studying littoral regions or cultures around the Indian Ocean world. And so I wanted to complicate that a little bit and see what happens when historians, and in this case, art historians, who are not actually Indian Ocean world scholars, but rather they work on they're Europeanists who are looking at a very specific kind of material culture component of the Indian Ocean world, that is South Asian textiles. So we'll see that this is a very special talk in multiple ways. Last but not least, because this is also about digital art history. And so I hope you really enjoy the talk. I know we'll have a lot of people from the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media who are hosting this event, and I hope you all enjoy the talk. So without further ado, let me just introduce the speakers and the talk. Dr. Marsely Kehoe specializes in 17th century Dutch art history, particularly trade in the Dutch colonial world. Her manuscript on urban planning in Batavia, vernacular architecture in Willemstad, still life painting of trade objects, and the Nautilus Cap is under contract with Amsterdam University Press. And she has published most recently in the Journal of Early Modern History and Journal of the Historians of Netherlandish Art. Dr. Kehoe works at Hope College, where she's involved in grants management in digital humanities and building a data analytics and science program. Welcome, Marsely. Dr. Carrie Anderson is an assistant professor of art history at Middlebury College in Vermont. Her primary area of research is the art of the 17th century Dutch Republic, within which she focuses on themes related to intra and intercultural diplomacy and gift exchange. Her first book project, The Art of Diplomacy in Early Modern Netherlands, Gift Giving at Home and Abroad, is under contract with Amsterdam University Press. In this talk, they will discuss their digital art history project on transoceanic circulation of South Asian textiles. The central component of their ongoing digital art history project, Visualizing Textile Circulation in the Dutch Global Market, 1602 to 1795, is an online visual glossary of historic textiles. This resource unites three different data types: textual, visual, and material, and provides users with open access to data, images, and dynamic visualizations. And so in this talk, they're going to present their proof of concept that has over 10,000 data points drawn from Dutch West Indian and East Indian Company archival sources that's from 1710 through 1715. And they will be talking about the challenges of building something like this, and which I'm very interested in personally. And also about the process of actually building an interactive web application based on art history, as well as Carrie will be talking about the Middlebury College undergraduate students using the programming language R for a 4-week pilot course called Data Science Across Disciplines, using the data Marsely and Carrie have put together. I forgot to welcome Carrie earlier, so welcome, Carrie, and thank you for being here. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to start out by thanking Deepti and also the Roy Rosenzweig Center for having us here. Both, I'm a huge fan of Omeka and I use it all the time in my classroom. And also it's really an honor to be included among the Indian Ocean cohort, especially as we're coming in as a colonizing power. And I hope you'll see that we're trying to work against that in this project. So we're presenting on our ongoing project. Since 2018, we've been collecting and organizing data, experimenting with tools and platforms, and we now have a preliminary data set for a 5-year period, as Deepti mentioned. I want to reiterate that this is still a work in progress. Not only do we want to extend our data set to include the whole 2 centuries of Dutch company trade, but also we still have a lot of decisions to make as we continue to refine our project. In today's presentation, I'll talk first about our data and textual sources, and then Carrie's going to take over to talk about preliminary data visualizations and our material and visual sources. Throughout, we're going to be jumping between close and distant reading, considering the possibilities and also limitations of our data. As with so many digital projects, and for global projects that cross disciplines, borders, materials, languages, centuries, ours is a collaborative project. This kind of work requires too many skills, too much time, and has too broad a scope to be done alone. Carrie and I are both art historians of the early modern Dutch, and we've differentiated ourselves as an East India Company expert, me, and Carrie as a West India Company expert, but perhaps that doesn't really mean much in the Indian Ocean context as real separation of disciplines. We also both work in digital humanities and digital art history, but we collaborate with others who have additional skills in this area. With the support of a Delmas grant and the Journal of Historians of Netherlandish Art, we've been able to connect with a project manager, Jen Hennel, and a web developer, Morgan Schwartz, who are going to be integral to our project going forward. Carrie will also speak about her collaborations with students. We're also relying on past scholars whose work on some of our specific documents we relied on to check our work. And that also steered our choice of the years that we included in our initial case study. And we're also drawing, with permission, on the digitized data of the Houken Institute's Bookkeeper General of Batavia. I have their website on a later slide, since you might want to see the captions to what you're looking at here. On this title slide, I've been highlighting blue and white textiles, both samples in a swatch book and an image of a Malaysian woman wearing blue and white checks. One textile that matches this description is guinea cloth, which caught our attention early on in this project because it was primarily exported from Indian ports, and then the name implies that it's intended for the Guinea coast of Africa. But our data, which produced this map here, just a preliminary map, our data shows that this story is a lot more complicated, and Carrie's going to explore that further in her presentation. So to give you an overview of our project, of the many types of commodities included on the cargo lists of Dutch East and West India companies, textiles of every color and variety were by far the most numerous cargoes. For Europeans wishing to trade in any region of the world, their ships needed to be laden with an abundant supply and variety of textiles, a testament to the already well-established global textile market. This trade was highly competitive, and success hinged on being able to provide those designs and fabrics that were most sought after by local traders. European traders were almost always responding to local patterns of consumption and demand, rather than, for instance, introducing novel fabrics into a hungry or depleted market. It is within this context that our project must be situated. For although much of our data is drawn from the extant archival records of the Dutch East and West India companies, our project does not prioritize Dutch colonial position. Instead, we seek to understand how shifts in textile price, quantity, color, and pattern were determined by changes in local patterns of consumption. We aim to bring together 3 types of data in our visual textile glossary: text, material, and visual. Our digital space will enable scholars in a range of disciplines to make meaningful connections between these discrete data types, and thus contribute more broadly to a deeper understanding of historic textiles and their social currencies. It is our contention that these textiles, like the people who wore them, have stories to tell. The aim of our project is to recover these stories, many of which have been lost to the destructive powers of colonialism and the bureaucratic legacy of the archival record. Researchers and students of historic textiles face a number of challenges when approaching textual, material, and visual information. For instance, first, many of the text brings up these issues of terminologies that are obsolete. So I've highlighted gingham here, which is ginghams in Dutch, or I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but whatever. That's a term that I know what it means. Dorothy wore a gingham dress, so I recognize that term. But then you go to look at this sample here that's in the V&A collection. And Irwin identified this in 1966 as gingham. It's currently listed as seersucker. And so this is obviously very different from Dorothy's dress and from what I understand gingham to be now. And also there's no reason why I should presume that this 1872 sample is related to the term I see on a 1693 document. So that's when we know what the terms mean. It gets even worse when we're working with terminologies that are really difficult to get at. However, some of the textile sources do offer us opportunities to refine meaning. Go ahead here. Because some of these textile terms in the textual documents are augmented with additional modifiers that allow some refinement of meaning, even where the textile names themselves are not clear. So I've highlighted from this detail, which I'll show you the larger image later on, some of the ones that have some of this kind of modifier information. So we see geographical information, but of course, like chintz from Patna does not mean it's from Patna. It might just be a design after a Patna chintz pattern. So even that geographical data is not necessarily straightforward. We also have things like color. So there's red and blue here. We have fiber type like silk, and then we have a pattern down at the bottom, the floral nightgowns. So there is additional information in the textual documents that we're hoping we can make be more meaningful. Beyond the text, the material poses a problem, as many of the textiles circulating on Dutch ships were of a low quality and thus are not preserved in museum collections, posing difficulties to scholars seeking extant examples that approach the scope of this trade. There's a lot of really fine examples of hand-painted chintz or kalamkari, for example, but there's not a lot of examples of coarser cloths or just some of these materials that are in the middle of the quality levels. Third, images of textiles, our third type of data, have been really incredibly valuable as a source of information. So picture a person wearing a garment, wearing a textile in a painting, and Carrie has some examples of this. Those are valuable, however, they also present other problems because we have to treat them cautiously as representations of textiles rather than actual images of textiles themselves. So Carrie and I were first drawn to this project because we could see that there was a lot of data. I was looking at sources like cargo lists like this. This is the full view of the earlier image. And I was looking at these because I was working on still life painting and looking for things like porcelain that show up in those paintings. I ended up focusing on pepper in my dissertation chapter because it was more consistent. But as I was working on this, I could just see how many textiles were included on these lists. So on this page, everything in those boxes are some kind of textile. And as you look from the 17th century onward, the amount of textiles, the different detailed lists of varieties of textiles grow over that time. So they're clearly a very important part of this trade. The Dutch are excellent record keepers, and the Dutch East and West India Company archives are extensive. Many of these are in the National Archives of the Netherlands, but they're also spread around the world in different collections. Many of these records originally were kept in multiple copies so that where one set doesn't survive, there's another. So this is a not complete set of data, but there's a lot to work with. And much of this data is numeric. So it initially coded obviously to us as data, but there's also a lot of geographic and textual information that we can work with. Especially after Pedro Pombo's talk last week, where he was drawing on archives liberally interpreted to try to get at those elusive migratory stories. It might seem to you at this point that we could possibly have extensive and complete textual data, but don't believe that. Our textual records do not tell the whole story. They don't tell us everything that we want to know about the movement of textiles or the exchange of textiles. They do hint at the perspective of some of the characters involved here, but it's only the Dutch merchants, capitalists, and clerks who are involved here. We've got some sense of what the cloth makers of Asia were producing and what Asian merchants were selling to the Dutch, but we don't see these agents really in the data, except perhaps in the naming of textiles, but that's filtered through Anglo-Dutch spelling and interpretation, and then also further by Carrie's and my interpretation. So there's a lot of barriers here. However, we do believe that there are ways to work against the intentions of the archive and get at these more social and cultural data. So looking at the sources themselves, I'm going to show you 3 examples just to show you what our primary sources are. There's a variety of documents that help tell this story of the movement of textiles throughout Asia, the Indian Ocean, and in the Atlantic Ocean on Dutch ships. So Dutch East India Company imports were published in broadsheets like what you're looking at here. And many of these have been preserved in the archives of company officials and merchants. And in this case, it also has manuscript information about prices. So I'll look a little closer at the next one, because the same exact information that was published in broadsheets, and I should say that the Dutch East India Company printed these themselves. It says at the very bottom of that sheet, if you want to read the bottom and if you read Dutch. So the company's putting out this kind of information themselves. But this information was also republished word for word in newspapers at the time. So they just shifted around the format a little bit, but you can make comparisons and see that it's exactly repeated. So in both cases, this shows there was a real contemporary interest in this kind of information that people wanted to know and read about, both merchants themselves and also the regular reader of newspapers. And what these texts tell us is essentially the same story over and over. It tells us the general cargo came from, in this case, 16 ships, and then it lists the names of all those ships. It tells us where that fleet of ships left from, on what date, and where they arrived. That's Batavia or Jakarta, and then it arrives in Texel, which is in the Dutch Republic. And then I've given you a segment here that shows about 50 different textiles. And I've only highlighted the 15,000 pieces of chintz from Patna. So that's not even all the chintz on this in this set of ships. So you can maybe see some of the size of this. The fact that these are all printed documents is fabulous because it's so much easier to work with as a historian, because I don't have to deal with handwriting. It shows both the contemporary interest in the 17th and 18th century in this information, but also much of this has been digitized. So what I can do is take the cargo lists that I have photographed and run this against the database that shows all of the Dutch East India Company ships and make sure I've got all my ships represented. And if I don't, I can go into the digitized newspaper archives and I can kind of fill out my data. There's also the Bookkeeper General of Batavia database that's maintained and was originally published by the Hawkins Institute. I don't know why there's an apostrophe there, I apologize. But this is a really great set of information. So they pulled from manuscript ledgers, basically all of the cargo on ships coming into Batavia and going out of Batavia. And they've given me permission to draw on that information in our data set. So that's wonderful. All to give you the other side of the story. So the West India Company is all manuscript. So there's a whole other layer of skill and time that's required to get at this information. So these are mostly held in the West India Company archives in The Hague in the Netherlands. Zooming in on this, if you can read it, basically it's the same story as the previous printed documents. So it tells us what ship this was, where it traveled from. So Horn is in the Dutch Republic and Angola is on the west coast of Africa. And then we have 20 pieces of red chintz and a value for that. We also have the length of those pieces too. So we have the same kind of story told here. So from these documents, we pulled together our data set of 5 years, which we thought would be a nice small number to work with. And we ended up, this is just the VOC side of just a snippet of it, which I know you can't read, but we had 9,000 records there and about 500 records on the WIC side. So it's pretty extensive. And that enabled us to figure out how we wanted to structure our data. And we're still even kind of working on that. This is a little bit more legible, but these are how the columns are organized in our data set. So I wanted to talk briefly to conclude my section here on some of the challenges that we've faced. So I've already mentioned a few of them, just dealing with terminology, terminology that's obsolete or hard to get at. We spent a lot of time looking at secondary sources, trying to understand this terminology. And that's both very helpful and also confusing and difficult because we see sometimes contradictions between the secondary sources, and also sometimes our data contradicts what we're reading. So it's difficult to interpret. There's also the changing nature of these terms. So they change over time. So even if we're able to pinpoint meaning in 1 year, that might not help us for a century earlier. We don't have complete information for each record in our data set. So there's a lot of empty spaces. But that's kind of the aim of doing this big data approach, is that we can kind of ideally shade in those unknowns as we go. We also have found that our data is not super duper clean, even though that is my #1 goal. This is especially a problem around spelling. So the Dutch are incredibly inconsistent in their spelling, even within one document. So we have to clean that up, and sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes it's not, as in the two textiles known as casa and kafa. So double S and a double F. Is it the same thing or not? And there's typeset issues with F's and S's. So I think they're two separate textiles. So I can't over clean this or that gets really problematic. We also have varying granularity of our dates and our geography. So sometimes we have a specific date, sometimes we have just a month, and sometimes just a year. Just a year is fine, but sometimes we have a range of months, as in like these 15 ships in this fleet came in July and August. So that's really annoying, I should say. In most cases, we only have the departure date or the arrival date, so we can estimate, but how accurate do we need to be for the sake of showing this data? And that also kind of shows you where the record was kept, so whether they have the departure or the arrival date. In just a few cases that we've run into so far, we also have a ship that wrecked. So if the textile left Batavia and never arrived, do we keep it in our data set or not? So that's a question we haven't resolved yet. So it's messy. Location's also a huge problem. Sometimes we have a port location, and this doesn't even tell you where the textile's from. It just tells you what port it was picked up in. So there's that problem that's just wholly aside from our data set. But sometimes we don't have a port and we just have a region. So that means that we're supplying regions for places where we do have ports so we can make comparisons. But then you have to be thoughtful about what kind of region you define. So like, if I have Masulipatam, do I want to say it's the Coromandel Coast? Do I want to say it's South Asia? Like, where do I want to draw the line between regions and make it a meaningful region for what we're doing? These are also historic names that are coming out of our documents. So that's problematic on a number of levels. So on one level, we need the modern names so that we can use current mapping softwares so that we can actually map these things. And we also want contemporary scholars to know what we're talking about. So using the modern name is very useful. But we're also historians and we want to reflect a historical moment, but we also don't want to reify the colonial moment. So there's a lot of choices that need to be made in how to do that well. Another place we run into challenges is in the value. So we have mostly Dutch guilders, but sometimes Indian or Indish guilders. Sometimes we have other currencies. Sometimes we have currencies that are, well, sometimes we have goods that are not listed in currencies. So the good is listed against another kind of good. So that becomes more difficult to parse. And I should also say Dutch currencies are difficult because they're a three-part currency. So the math gets complicated. So it's guilders, stovers, and penningen. But if you are working in R, I would highly recommend the package built by Jesse Sadler to deal with the math of a three-part currency. Also, these textile units, there's just a problem in every single field of our data set. The units are really complicated because we mostly have things that are pieces, but sometimes we have a sense of how big that piece is, and we want to be able to compare that across different kinds of textiles. Carrie has somewhat found some consistency on her side, but I have not, so we're still working with that. So I'm just talking about the challenges of our textual data. There's many more complications when you bring in the material and the visual data. I'm going to turn over now to Carrie, who's going to show what we've been able to do with this data set that we have, and then also make connections to the material and the visual and show kind of the ongoing challenges of this topic. Let's stop my share. Carrie, you're still on mute.
Hi, again. I just wanted to first reiterate my thanks. We're really grateful to be a part of this and happy to be here. So thank you, Deepti, for inviting us. So Marsely has talked a bit about the sources of our data. I'm going to pick up where she left off and demo a web application that was made with these first 5 years of data. Before I show you the app, I want to just quickly tell you about its creation. This app was built as part of a new pilot course at Middlebury College called Data Science Across Disciplines, which Deepti mentioned. In this 4-week intensive course, it's a winter term course, students attended 2 1.5-hour sessions per day, 4 days a week, so it was really intensive. In the morning, the students, myself included, we were taught the programming language R by a professor of mathematics in the afternoon. And then they applied what they learned in the morning session in R to discipline-specific data sets. And this was led by faculty in economics, biology, Japanese linguistics, and then of course art history. So it was truly interdisciplinary. It was a really wonderful experience. My group of students spent the 4 weeks working with our textile data. And so they did some cleaning of the data, a lot of cleaning of it, and it's still messy, and making data visualizations, which as you'll see, culminated in the development of this interactive web application. I'd be happy to talk more about the structure of the class in the Q&A if anyone is interested, but for now, I'm just going to demo the app. which I'll use sort of as a way to illustrate some of the issues that we see as being critical to our project. So one quick note about the app I'm about to share. When I'm done with the demo, Deepti is going to drop it into the chat, so you're welcome to play around with it. I would kindly ask that you don't make it public or share it widely for the simple reason that it's really not finished. The students who made this, Ev Berger-Wolf, Cameron Kudmeyer, Jason Rickenbacker, and Nicholas Slider, they did so in 4 weeks, right? This entire thing was made in 4 weeks. And although they did an amazing job, we really haven't had a chance to do any end user testing, and even sort of preparing for this talk, I noticed some problems. There's still some other additional changes that we would like to make before it goes public. So I would just ask that you don't share it widely, and also that you would wait until I'm done with the demo in order to play around with it, simply because the app might crash because it's a prototype. Okay, so this group of students named their app the Interactive Textile Explorer, as you can see here. And this app enables you to search our data. You can see up here by company, so the West India Company, the East India Company, or both. You can search by quantity or by value. And quantity is measured either in L's, or the more problematic pieces, as Marsely suggested, or value, which at this point does not take into account the differences in value between Dutch and Indian guilders. So again, I've hardly gotten very far before I've given you a sense of some of the challenges of working with this material. You can also visualize the data, and you can see here, you can search by origin and destination as well. But you can also visualize the data according to different textile modifiers that are part of the archival data set. So such as color, or pattern, or process, or fiber. But then also values that were assigned by the student. So you can choose a value range. And so here, students practiced using the R function mutate in order to create ranges of value: expensive, inexpensive, or mid-range. And this is based on the price per unit, which for the West India Company was mostly recorded. For the East India Company, it was not. So that data was also generated by the students with just a little bit of math, and again, helped by Jesse Sadler's DebKeeper package. And then of course, you can also search by textile, which we will do right about now. So if you look here, we have all of the textiles that are represented in our data set, which is quite a few. And so you can search by these individually, or you can search by a number of them at the same time. I'm going to go ahead and look at Salampores, which is a cotton cloth that has been variously defined in secondary sources. And I'm going to go ahead and switch this to destination. I'm going to scroll down here, and that's all I'm going to do for now. I'm just going to click to update the map, and then click to update the table. Now I'm going to go over here to the Map Explorer, and you'll see that all of the regions in which Salampores were shipped, so their destination, are highlighted here, and they're highlighted according to quantities. And you see a legend over here on the side. Now, what I can do if I click on a country, so let's say I'm going to click on Indonesia. So this is, of course, this is dark red because this is where Batavia is, which was, let me just zoom in a little bit. This is the primary Dutch outpost, trade post. So what you can see is when I click on it, first I get the total quantity of Salampores that have been have gone to Batavia from that region. But what you see also happens down here is that this pie chart and this bar chart become populated. Now, the way the students set this up is really great. You can continue to modify this. So for example, I can modify the pie chart and I can have it look at value range, and then I'll modify the bar chart by color. And if I update the graphs, you'll see now that all the pores are accounted for here as being mostly mid-range, some inexpensive, and a small sliver are expensive. And then you can also see the colors, the range of colors that are indicated. And again, this is just the pores that are going to Batavia. So we see this blue-green category, which I'll talk about in a second, no color indicated, which I'll spend some more time discussing, and red. So it's really valuable to be able to dig down a little bit deeper into the data. Now, let's say I'm not interested in a particular textile type, but rather I want to look at colors. So one of the assignments which has that I gave to the students, I think maybe the second week of class, was to use this mutate function to create different categories. And one of the things I had them create was color categories. This may not stay in the final app, but what they essentially did was create a category in which all textiles that are labeled as blue, green, light blue, light green, all got bunched into this one color category. Let me go ahead and switch these back to just textile name. If I go ahead and click to update the map, right, we'll now see that we have a representation of all of, well, I guess we're still here looking at Indonesia, but these are all the textiles. Let's go ahead and look at Angola. And these are all the blue-green textiles that would have been shipped to Angola. We could then further refine this with these modifiers below if we wanted to as well. So what I wanted to show you, just one more quick thing before I leave and go to the app and go to a PowerPoint, is this table explorer here. And this we were really excited about because it makes our data, the raw data, accessible. So when you click on the table explorer, I think that I updated it. Let me just make sure I did. What you see is all of the data that's represented on the map. Yeah, that should be it. So if we go over, we should see here, this is textile color archival. So we see all blue, blue, brown, blue, black, blue, 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 green. And that is available. These are the first 25 records, but you can download the whole table by just clicking that, and then you get an Excel file. So we really do want to make our data accessible and easy for people to download and use. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop sharing this, and I'm just going to head over to a PowerPoint. Okay, just give me one sec. Okay. Okay, so by taking a distant view of these data, we get a glimpse of what kinds of textiles are traveling and where during this 5-year period. And our hope, as we increase our data set over time, is that we'll be able to detect patterns that can give us a sense of local markets to which the Dutch companies were responding. And here I'm showing the textiles that traveled from Batavia to Yemen, which you can see, in fact, was dominated by pores. Here, this large orange color. This approach also enables us to compare textile imports and exports over time. So, and also between geographies. To show just one example, these two graphs show the number of perpetuanen, which was a thick wool fabric made in England, Flanders, and Holland, and dyed various colors. This shows perpetuanen shipped to Benin and Batavia from the Netherlands, and it also does a bit of a breakdown of color. So you can see perpetuanen going to Benin is blue, red, and green primarily, where there's no color indicated when it's traveling to Batavia. These patterns show distinctive trends, which are presumably driven by consumer demand, and yet the archival record leaves no trace of this because it's structured according to the semantic necessities of early modern accounting practices, whereby value was entirely dependent on the systematic, if sometimes inconsistent and incomplete, translation of visible material characteristics like color and pattern into descriptive text, rather than by the social values they may have had for a given consumer group. So by taking a distant view of these data, we hope to take steps towards retrieving some of the values that have been hidden by or excluded from the archival record. But we are art historians, and we can't do this with text data alone, nor do we want to. And here is where we start actually to run into some additional challenges, because so much gets lost in this translation from textile to text. So let's think about a textile that's described as blue in the archives. What kind of blue is it? Is it light blue? Is it dark blue? What pattern is it? Is it striped? How thick were the stripes? Were they vertical? Were they horizontal? Was it checked? Were the checks big or small? We just don't have a lot of answers to these questions. And in many cases, as you'll see, we have neither primary nor secondary modifiers, making it incredibly difficult to imagine what some of these textiles may have looked like. Swatch books like this 1788 example from the National Archives in The Hague are harder to come by in the 17th and early 18th centuries, but they give us somewhat, sort of, I would say, maybe daunting sense of the information that is lost in the translation from text to image. So let's, in this case, just focus on the blue textiles. So notice the first page here, there are 4 types of blue textiles that we might describe as blue and white, striped or checked, and how these patterns in the fabric are of various size and design. And yet the accompanying description describes them only as blue, with no mention of the fact that they are white also, and that they have patterns. Now, on the next page, we again have 2 more textiles, which in this case are described by their checked pattern, using the terms routin and pepita, but there is no indication of their color. On the last page, there are 4 more blue and white textiles that in 3 of the 4 cases are labeled by associated geographies, and Marsely talked a little bit about that, but not by their visual characteristics, demonstrating again how much knowledge is embedded and sometimes subsequently lost in a textile name. And notice number 19, here we have yet another kind of textile that's labeled as gingham, but looks very different than the examples that Marsely showed us. Now, it may be that the person who compiled this swatch book would have thought it redundant to describe a textile in detail when the swatch is right there. However, I can personally attest to the fact that textile descriptions do not become more verbose in the absence of swatches. Nikanis, for example, and that's number 18, this is a textile that I see listed on West India Company manuscripts pretty frequently. And it is never, and I checked before this talk, it is never accompanied by a modifier of any kind. Nor is Platilios, which is this white textile here. This was a textile that was often used in the slave trade. It's clearly white in color, and secondary sources also describe it as such, but archival documents never do. And by secondary sources, I mean modern secondary sources. In fact, in the majority of cases, white is only used as a modifier for textiles that were more commonly associated with another color, like guinea cloth or salampors, which are most often, but not always, but most often blue. So when they're white, it's noted in the documentation because it's a departure. Or textiles that come in a wide range of colors. So which could be something like deckins, which come in blue, green, red, or white. Those will often be indicated as white, but for the most part, white is not often indicated except in those contexts. So a big question that Marsely and I have is, at what point can we assume that a given color has a consistent set of visual characteristics? That is, at what point can we create a new column in our data set called inferred color or inferred pattern. This is indeed of great consequence for our project because the absence of modifiers impacts our ability to infer any conclusive patterns to the data. These two pie charts, which show all the textiles being imported into Batavia and into the Netherlands, just to pick two places that have a lot of textiles coming in. I've organized them here according to color modifier, and this gives you an idea of the scope of the problem, right? This purple color in both charts is where there's no color indicated. We're hoping, however, that our project can begin to fill in some of these gaps by digging a little bit deeper into the data. So, for example, let's go back and take a closer look at Benin. If we look only at the archival color modifiers, and this is the chart on the left, and exclude the cases in which nothing is noted, we see the majority of textiles are in the blue-green category, right? And that's this big black part of the pie here. If, however, we include the instances where no color is indicated, it looks a lot different, with the majority having no modifier. But let's take an even closer look at those textiles that do not have an archival modifier. So the pie chart on the right identifies the names of the textiles that don't have modifiers. So this large purple part is now expanded here along with the names of the textiles. What you'll see is this large yellow part here. These are all sloplockens, which are used bed sheets. And these were shipped in large numbers from the Netherlands to the west coast of Africa. And that these make up about 75% of the textiles without modifiers. Now, I've yet to confirm this with absolute certainty, but secondary sources indicate that sloplockens were white or at least a sort of natural color. If we combine that with platilios, which you see here, which you've already seen an example that is white, and grachis, which are also described as white, all of a sudden our color distribution starts to look quite a bit different. And in fact, you can imagine that it would change from being mostly blue-green, as we saw in the earlier case, to being mostly white, about 75% of white textiles shipped into Benin, and only about 25% of that blue-green color. So why is this important? Well, in some cases, it helps to better contextualize some of the assumptions of early modern travel literature and images. So, for example, travel literature consistently recounts that Africans living in different parts of Africa wore blue and white striped garments. An early 17th century visitor to Senegal, for example, described seeing people wearing cotton robes, quote, full of blue stripes like featherbed teaks. Olfert Dapper, on the other hand, although he had certainly never been to Africa himself, nevertheless describes blue and white cloth woven in Benin, as did other visitors describe similar cloths. This pervasive conflation of blue and white garments with the African continent also extended to enslaved Africans living in Brazil and was reinforced by images as early as the first half of the 17th century. Famously, Albert Eichhout's African woman wears a blue and white checked skirt, which serves as a material link to his African man, who, as has been convincingly argued by Rebecca Breenan, is supposed to be a slave trader on the so-called Gold Coast. Drawings by Zacharias Wagner, who worked for a time as the steward to Governor General Johann Maurits in Brazil, also features blue and white striped garments worn by enslaved people in his drawings. Modern day scholars have likewise reiterated that these blue and white textiles are typical, quote, African cloth, or that the clothing is, quote, characteristic of Brazilian slaves, not necessarily making the distinction between blue and white textiles made in Africa, of which there were many varieties, and the blue and white textiles produced in India or in Europe, and subsequently shipped to Africa for trade. Distinguishing between the origins of textile is tricky, and it's one of the challenges of our research, especially in the 18th century when a number of imitation blue and white cloths were made. In fact, the 1753 letter housed in the Zeeland archives in Middelburg is from a textile trader, and it included 2 samples of blue and white cloth, one that's labeled Oostindisch, an indication of its authentic Asian provenance, and one labeled Nachgemaakt, or counterfeit. Challenges aside, the traditional association of blue and white textiles with African consumers by both early modern and modern scholars tells only half the story at best. If we look only at those textiles imported into Africa on West India Company ships, our data suggests that blue textiles, and again, this is just Benin, but our data suggests that blue textiles, which we've seen from the archival swatch book, may indeed have been blue and white patterned, represent only a quarter of the imported textiles, which suggests that they were relatively rare, and for that reason may have in fact had an elevated status. Cécile Froment has already argued that in mid-17th century, the Congo elite incorporated imported blue and white textiles into local sartorial systems as a demonstration of authority, a practice, Froment argues, that is evident in the incorporation of a blue and white textile around the waist of this Congo ambassador. And in fact, we know from our data in the 18th century that some blue and white textiles, like guinea cloth, for example, were indeed quite expensive, a likely reflection of their high status in the communities in which they circulated. As a side note, modern secondary sources consistently refer to guinea cloth as both coarse and inexpensive. And at some moments in time, this might certainly have been the case, but our current data set between 1710 and 1715 does not reflect this. So the black portions of these pie charts represent the expensive category, which means it was more than 10 guilders per piece. And I can say anecdotally that they were more often 20 guilders per piece. And I suspect that some of this mid-range pricing is actually an error, and it should be an expensive range, because sometimes guinea cloth, because I think it was so expensive at this point, was actually measured by half piece. So I think this does not even reflect how expensive these cloths were. So as these few brief examples show, there are both resonances and disparities between these textiles, texts, and images, disjunctures that reveal the fragmented and uneasy connections between people and cloth. It is nonetheless these sometimes uncomfortable intersections between image, text, and textile that are the most interesting and that we feel have the potential to be the most productive. So in closing, I just wanted to speak briefly about a part of our project, like the other parts, that's very much in progress, but which my students started to design during the winter term course, and a couple of them are continuing to work on. So here is a still from a student presentation of a web application that enables users to search through the material and pictorial record. So both the textile samples and the images of textiles that were worn as garments. What's great about this web application is that you can search through these visual data sets by the same textile modifiers that are part of the archival record. So modifiers like blue, red, striped, or floral. And then you can also simultaneously perform a similar search of the archival data. And so you can see there's a chart above that you can search for archival data, and then below the image data. You're probably wondering why I'm showing you a still of their wonderful presentation and not the app itself, and that has to do, of course, with server space, since the image files are so large. So it cannot be hosted publicly yet because the free version of Shiny, which is how these apps were made, doesn't allow for enough space, but we're working on that. So the goal of this project, of this part of the project rather, is to enable users to make connections and in the process to generate knowledge about these historic textiles and their representation. And if along the way they undermine some imperialist assumptions, that's great too. So with that, I think I will end it there to make sure that we have time for questions. But I'd also really like to emphasize how anxious we are for feedback. As you can see, this is very much in progress at this very early stage, either in the Q&A or privately. And also, we'd like to invite everyone, if they have any data or images that they want to share that you feel as though we must know about, we'd be happy to accept that as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Marsely and Carrie, for that wonderful presentation. There was so much in there that that I learned, and that's really, really, really exciting to get to know, because some of those things, like you hear about these textiles, but then as sort of data, like you look at them very differently. And so as an art historian, I think it's really great to see that come together and all the progress you've made. I want to open it up for Q&A now. So I do have a few questions here, but in the interest of making this, because there's so much, I want to divide this into two groups. One sort of like conceptual, and the other sort of very sort of DH based and on the project itself and the intricacies of the project. So if you have those listening, if you have questions, comments, please put them in the chat window, and then I will read them out to Marsely and Carrie. So to get us started, while you're doing that, I'm going to get started with the questions we already have. Vidit Raina asked earlier on, and this question was to you, Marsely, do you envision broadening, and to both of you actually, do you envision broadening your data sets and research to incorporate records from sites of production in India? This is a wonderful initiative.
Yeah, we definitely want to build something that can be added to by any other kind of data that's related to this project or this type of exchange. So we started obviously with the Dutch because that's where we have our language skills. But also I know there's a lot of other colonial records, but then also more local records that would be really interesting to incorporate. And we really want to bring in other scholars who have those skills and languages to get at the material that we haven't been able to. So our aim is ultimately to build something that, for one, we can keep adding to when we fill out the further 190 or so years of material, but then also that other people can contribute to as well. There was another question about ethnographic data being added into it, and that is a really interesting question, and I don't know how to answer it, because I don't know if we're creating a structure that will enable different kinds of data or not, but it's something to keep in mind. So thank you for that one as well.
We have a couple of questions from Jadwalia, and I'm going to just condense all of that because it's very sort of the nitty-gritties of doing things, and we can have a conversation later about this as well. The questions are, how were the attributes for the dashboard selected or finalized? And will you be considering image similarity analysis for patterns in these textiles?
That's a great question. We're not, as far as image similarity, we haven't quite gotten there yet. We're still, I mean, that's would be a great approach, I would think. It's tricky because so many of them are so similar, and I don't know enough about it, right? The blue and white striped and checked textiles are really so similar, and comparing them, I'm just trying to imagine ways how exactly that would work in practice. But I'd have to think about that. And I'm sorry, what was the first part of the question?
I think it was about the attributes for the dashboard, how it was selected or finalized. That was the first part of the question.
On the application?
Yeah.
Oh, well, you'd have to ask the students. They really did do this. I mean, they had some guidance of some things that I wanted to have on this application, but in large part, they designed this whole application. And some of it is determined by Shiny, which is what they used, the name of the program that they used within the R programming language to design this. So these different tabs that they created were in part determined by that.
Thank you. There are a few questions about whether this would be made accessible to the public in the near future, the interactive textile explorer. I have put the link in the chat. I can put it again in case anyone is interested in taking it for a spin. Please make sure that it might crash, as Carrie mentioned earlier. But don't worry about crashing it, is what Carrie's guidance is on that.
It is just a prototype, and you'll see as you go through it, as I was, that there are some little things. So, you know, the textile Nikanase, it's listed twice because it's spelled 2 different ways. So this is some stuff that we need to clean up. So please do let us know if you find any mistakes, but also realize that it really isn't done yet.
Great. So the next question is from Eliza West. She asks, does the blue and whites representing only 25% of the imports mean they were rare, or simply that the used bed sheets, perhaps used for other things, were prolific?
Yeah, this is something that I've thought a lot about as well. There is some secondary source indication of the slop lockins, the bed sheets, as being used as garments, but I don't know exactly where this information is coming from. So it's coming from 20th century scholars that there's no citation, so I haven't been able to get my hands on it. So it is absolutely possible that the slop lockins are used for something other than garments, but there does seem to be some indication that they were used as garments. So I don't have a good answer, but it's something that I've been thinking quite a bit about, and I'm very curious.
There's also such a wide variety in volume on the Dutch East India side versus the West India side. So for instance, when we were looking at that guinea cloth, we saw that most of it was going to Europe and staying there. I mean, we only have this 5-year period, so we don't have the whole picture, but the presumption that it was all going to Africa was quite wrong. A lot of it was staying in Southeast Asia as well. So there's whole other markets that aren't even accounted for. So it's kind of hard to say at this point also.
Yeah. And I would just add one more thing about the difference in price between them. So within our 5-year period, as I mentioned, the guinea cloth was generally about 20 guilders per piece, whereas the slop lockins were incredibly inexpensive. So not even what it was, I think it was 17.5 stouvers per piece. So considerably, I mean, really on that inexpensive, the least expensive textile that I dealt with, I think.
So I'm just going to go with the next question, and then I'm going to get to one of the questions that I find really interesting. So sorry, I'm not going to go in order for the next couple of questions. Tanya, I think Jones, she says, thank you so much, Marsely and Carrie. The open access and interactive visualizations of your project are especially exciting. Can you tell us a bit about your website? What platform are you using? Are you planning to ultimately integrate the visualization apps into that? These are questions and concerns that she's also thinking about in her project.
Mm-hmm. So this is using Shiny, which is part of the R language kind of larger package. And in terms of what this will eventually look like, I mean, we do want to have an independent website that's able to incorporate not only things like the interactive textile explorer and also the image data sets that would also be searchable. But our end goal is to really have a visual textile glossary in which all of these things can be incorporated together so that we could have images of textiles with more definitive terms, but that's also supported by the circulation data that we've seen and by images and possibilities. I mean, I myself think that the most likely scenario is that we'll have a textile name or a textile type with a number of examples of images of textiles or actual swatches that could be that textile. I don't know how exact we're ever going to be able to be with the historical record, but I think that we can certainly get to meaningful places. And I think if we have the idea is to have a website that can incorporate as many of these different resources as possible. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Marsely.
Oh, I should add, we were interested in using IIIF for our images. So we want to be able to like draw from a variety of sources. So on one hand, so we're not hosting all the images ourselves, but also so that we can connect out to other organizations as well.
Thank you. So Angela Ho, she is one of the Mason faculty and obviously knows the two of you because I say it says nice to see you. It's interesting to see how data from the cargo lists, etc., and other kinds of textual and visual sources work together. Thank you so much for sharing. You mentioned that traders seem to be responding to local tastes and trends. Is there evidence on how the demand of the end consumers shape the production at all?
Mm-hmm.
I know there's some descriptions of traders being frustrated by the particular tastes of local markets, because it's just considering the logistics and the time required in order to feed a local market. I think, Carrie, I think you might have had something where they were trying to have such a variety that they hoped they could like hit a couple people's interests. I can't remember the exact references.
Yeah, and there were also, I mean, I know that there are instances in which, I mean, I would say Dutch merchants were generally pretty aware of what the trends were, at least, you know, I can speak more directly to the West Coast of Africa. So they, as a result of this, were participating in inter-African trade. So they would take one textile one place, trade it for one thing, bring another textile another place. And so in that sense, I think that they were absolutely responding to the demands of the consumers by participating within that inter-African trade.
Sarah Fee, who is going to be our speaker next week. So, and she's also going to talk about textiles, but in Africa, and she's going to talk about fashion. So please come back next week for Sarah's talk. She asks, do you have textile historians as part of the project? More broadly, and she says, wonderful project and presentation, of course. And then she asks, more broadly, I'm wondering how we can better bring art historians and textile historians into dialogue. Unfortunately, the disciplines and worlds have been largely separated.
Mm-hmm. We want to have, we want this. We want to have textile historians associated with our project, absolutely, because we're not specialists in textiles. And so we feel definitely imposter syndrome a lot when we're dealing with this material because we're kind of learning as we go. So this is something that we want desperately, I would say. And we have reached out to some people, but it's, you know, as you say, it's hard to have this dialogue also when everyone is busy and doing 100 other things too. So we're working on that if you're interested.
And this is sort of going to be our final question that I have here. If I missed anything from the chat window, please feel free to unmute and ask that question after this or any other questions that come up. This final question is actually from the final speaker in another week's time, Urmila Mohan. She's also going to be talking about textiles, but from her experience as a curator of Southeast Asian textiles and putting together like a Southeast Asian textile exhibition. And so she's going to come and talk to us on April 22nd. She asks, students often have the best questions on these kinds of ideas and projects that often go unacknowledged. Could you share one instance where an actual classroom interaction shaped the project or made a contribution?
That's such a wonderful question. They contributed so much, not just in what they produced, but all along the way we were learning, and they had these questions as we went, because they didn't, I mean, most of them had not ever even taken an art history class or material culture, anything like that. So it was very new. And one of the first assignments that I did, I had them each pick one textile and just, you know, try to make some visualizations and see what they could find. And one student, I think, picked, I think it was Batilis. It's not a textile that I see on my list, but he noticed that there was never any indication of color. I mean, and this is really simple and straightforward, but I just hadn't thought of it, but that every single instance of this textile was recorded as bleached. And he said, could I just call it white? And I was like, yeah, you probably just could call it white. But, you know, these are the kinds of sort of just things that they noticed on a daily basis. This is one example, I would say, of many. And I had a lot of econ students in my class. So they sort of looked at me and they said, 5 years of data, aren't you supposed to have a big sample? And meanwhile, Marsely and I are saying, you know, we've got 10,000 entries here. This is so much data, but they weren't impressed. So, yeah.
They also really pushed us on the issue of the textile size, because I know I kept pushing back and saying, well, it's going to be, there must be a consistency within each type of what size it is, because it's presumably coming from one kind of loom. But they're like, no, tell us how many yards or L's it was. So
yeah,
we still don't have any answer, but they really pushed us in a way that we're like convinced that they're right.
No, those are great questions, and some of these things that art historians don't pay a lot of attention to, you know, seems to be a problem when you think about artistry in big data terms, as I'm realizing it myself every day. And so one more question. What are ways you think the app can be improved to better incorporate and present data?
Well, this question is from Jingza, who is going to be my summer research assistant, who's going to help us refine this. So, well, I think we can absolutely have that conversation before you start working this summer.
Romita,
more pictures.
Yeah. One more question. Romita Ray asked, did students have the opportunity to work with actual textiles?
In this case, no, because everyone was remote. So winter term was remote. This was all done via Zoom. In an ideal world, I'd love to have a class like this, you know, that runs the whole semester and that incorporates trips to museums and interaction with textiles and images, but nobody was in the same place.
And I should say one of my side projects is to play on my new loom and like try to recreate some of these textiles, which has been really, it's not really actually recreating, but it's really making me think about weave and pattern and making me pay attention to those things. So kind of going into the material world in my hobby life is also fun.
Yeah, no, I think that's important too, because one thing that when you do this kind of thing is you kind of disconnect yourself from the sensoriality of the creation, the process of creating these things. So I might get a loom myself because it takes a certain kind of, you know, dexterity and juggling to get the textile to look the way it has to look. And so, and I know Sarafi is very, very experienced in thinking about textiles in this way. So, because she's a curator of South Asia at the Royal Ontario Museum, and she works with textiles a lot. So I hope Sarah kind of points to those, that kind of materiality and that aspect of textiles next week. If we are done with the Q&A, I think it's time for us to wrap up. I think the speakers, whoever are present here, and I and Dan, who's ably assisting us get this thing together, we're going to hang out a while here. So you're welcome to actually stay on here, but otherwise thank you for all of you for coming, and hope we'll see you next week. We are available on our website. All the information is available on our websites at iowmaterialhistorieswebinar.org. Thank you.